For 11 months, my grandson called me crazy for my money, until one hidden letter destroyed his entire plan. I want to tell you about the notebook first because everything else sits on top of it. It's a spiral-bound thing. 5 inches by 7. Black cover. I bought it at the drugstore on Merriman Avenue in November of 2019, about 3 weeks after we buried Margaret. I bought it because I'd started forgetting the small things, not the way Tyler would later pretend, not the way he'd describe it to a cousin in Tennessee. I was forgetting the order of small things, the order Margaret used to keep for me. Which mail went where, which bills were on autopay, the name of the woman at the bank who used to wave at us through the window. Small things, husband things. So I bought a notebook, and I started writing things down. Dates, names, the exact words people said when something felt off. I'd been a contractor for almost 4 decades. I knew the value of a written record. You can't argue with a man who has the paperwork in his hand. You can yell at him, but you can't move him, Aunt. The notebook lived on the kitchen table. Margaret's chair was to the left of it. I kept her chair where it was. I still do. Some men move the chair. I didn't. In late 2022, Tyler started calling more often. He'd always called. Once a month, sometimes twice. He'd ask about the truck. He'd ask if I was eating. He'd tell me about his job in Charlotte, which was something with software and which I never fully understood. But I'd nod into the phone like I did. He was the only grandson I had. James and I hadn't spoken since 2017, but Tyler had stayed. That mattered. In October of 2022, on a Sunday afternoon, he asked me a question. He said, "Pops, have you ever thought about what happens to everything? Like the house, the accounts, all that?" I was at the kitchen table. The notebook was closed in front of me. The afternoon light was coming through the window over the sink, hitting the toaster. I remember the toaster. I don't know why. I said, "I've thought about it." He said, "I just mean, I want to be helpful. If you ever want to talk through any of that, I'm here." I said, "I appreciate that, Tyler." He said, "Of course. Just, curious." When I hung up the phone, I sat for a minute, and then I opened the notebook. I wrote, October 16th, 2022. Tyler asked about the house and the accounts. Said he wanted to be helpful. Said he was curious. I didn't write what I was thinking yet. I just wrote what he said. That was the rule of the notebook. Write what they said, not what you think it means. The meaning shows up later, on its own. There is a difference between being old and being unprepared. I learned that early in the trades. The old man on the job site is the one who knows where every shutoff valve is. He's not the one who got slow. He's the one who got patient. In November, Tyler called again. He asked the same question, but smoother this time. He'd thought about how to phrase it. He said he'd been reading about estate planning and wanted to know if I had everything in order. He said it was important for tax reasons. He said the word tax twice. He used the phrase stepped-up basis, which I knew, and which he didn't seem to know I knew. I let him say it. I said, "I've got an attorney who handles that for me." He said, "Oh, who?" I said, "Louise Renshaw, in Asheville." He said, Cool. Just good to know." I wrote that down. November 11th, 2022, Tyler asked again. Mentioned estate planning. Asked who my attorney is. I told him Louise. That was the first red flag. I want to be honest with you. I didn't know it was a red flag yet. I thought he was being a young man who'd been told by somebody that he should care about money. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I was his grandfather. That was the job. In December, he came up for 2 days around Christmas. He hugged me. He brought a bottle of bourbon I would never open and a card his girlfriend had signed for him. He looked around the house in a way he hadn't before. He looked at the cabinet over the refrigerator. He looked at the safe behind the desk in the den, which he couldn't have seen because there was a coat over it. But he looked toward it anyway, like a man checking a room he'd been told to remember. He asked if I'd thought about moving somewhere smaller. I said, "This is my house, Tyler. I built it." He said, Yeah, I know. I just worry about you on the stairs. I'm 64 years old. I walk 3 miles every morning. I take the stairs 2 at a time when nobody's watching. I didn't say any of that. I said, I'm fine on the stairs. He smiled the smile of a man who'd been told to drop it and try again later. That night, after he went to bed in the guest room, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The notebook was open. I wrote, December 23rd, 2022. Tyler asked about moving, said he worried about the stairs, looked at the safe. I also wrote down something he'd said at dinner that I'd let slide in the moment because I wasn't sure I'd heard it right. He'd said, Pops, you should really let me help you with the bills sometime. I could come up for a weekend, sit at the kitchen table, get it all squared away for you. I'd nodded the way an old man nods when he's not committing to anything. He took the nod for what he wanted it to be and moved on. But I wrote it down. December 23rd, 2022, 6:42 p.m. Tyler offered to help with the bills, said he could come up for a weekend. That was a small one. But small things in a notebook stack up. A small thing on a Tuesday, a small thing on a Saturday, and another small thing 3 weeks later. Pretty soon you have a stack of small things that all point the same direction. A contractor knows that. The crack in the drywall above the door, the damp spot in the corner of the basement, the smell of mildew in the laundry room. None of them is the problem by itself. All of them are the problem together. Then I closed the notebook, and I sat with it under my hand, and I thought about Margaret. She used to read at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings. She had a way of holding a book in one hand and a mug in the other, and her hair would fall forward, and I'd watch her without saying anything. 41 years, and I still watched her like a man who wasn't sure she was real. I thought about what she would have said. She would have said, Henry, you watch that boy. So I watched. I watched on Christmas morning when he opened the small envelope I'd made for him, with a check inside for $1,000, the same check I'd written him every Christmas since he turned 18. He looked at the check the way a man looks at a number he's already counted on. He folded it. He put it in his pocket. He thanked me with his mouth, but not with his eyes. Margaret would have noticed that. I noticed it because Margaret had taught me to. I watched on Christmas afternoon when he stood in front of the bookshelf in the den, where I keep the framed photograph of Margaret and me at the lake in 1986. He stood there for almost a minute, looking at her face. I watched him watch her, and I realized that he didn't actually remember her. He'd been 7 when she died. He remembered the idea of her, the grandmother who'd given him cookies and called him Tiger. He didn't remember the woman. He didn't remember how she looked at a man when she'd decided he was wrong about something. He'd never had to find out. I watched on Christmas evening when he took a phone call in the driveway and stayed out there for 40 minutes in the cold. I don't know who he was talking to. I never asked. I wrote down the time he went out and the time he came back. December 23rd, 2022, 8:14 p.m. to 8:54 p.m. Tyler took a phone call in the driveway. 40 minutes. It sounds like watching too closely. I know it does. It wasn't. It was the same thing a man does on a job site when he notices the new guy keeps disappearing behind the dumpster. You don't accuse the new guy. You just write down what time he leaves and what time he comes back, and you keep an eye on the copper wire. I want to step back and tell you something about how I got the letter, because it matters now. In the spring of 2022, about a year before any of this started, I went to lunch with Louise Renshaw at a place near her office. We'd been working together since 2008. She'd handled the company sale. She'd handled Margaret's will. She'd handled the small estate Margaret's mother left her, which was not small to Margaret, but small to a lawyer. Louise is in her early 50s. She's careful. She doesn't talk fast. She's the kind of lawyer who reads a page 3 times before she nods. Over lunch, she said to me, Henry, have you thought about a competency evaluation? I said, for what? She said, for you, while you don't need one. I laughed. I said, I don't need one because I don't need one. She said, right. That's why you should get one. And then she explained it to me. She said when wealthy people get into their 60s and 70s, especially widowers, especially people with estranged children, the family sometimes turns. Not always. Often enough that she'd seen it. She said the easiest way to take a man's choices away from him was to claim he wasn't competent to make them. She said it was almost impossible to fight that claim after the fact, but it was easy to short-circuit it in advance. One letter, one neuropsychologist, one date stamp. She said, if you ever need it, it's there. If you never need it, you spent an afternoon. I said, who's the neuropsychologist? She said, Dr. Patricia Merritt, Mission Health. She's the one I send people to. I thought about it for a week. I thought about James and the way he'd stopped calling in 2017. I thought about Tyler, who at that point had only just started calling more. I thought about the lot off Highway 19, and the brokerage accounts, and the IRA, and how all of it had Margaret's name on it once, and how she had trusted me to handle it. I called Louise back and I scheduled the evaluation. April 14th, 2022. I drove to Asheville. I sat in Dr. Merritt's office for 3.5 hours. She gave me tests I hadn't taken since I was a kid and tests I'd never taken at all. She asked me to remember lists of words. She asked me to do math without paper. She asked me about my finances in detail, my decisions, my values, the way I made choices. She asked me to draw a clock. I drew the clock. She smiled. At the end, she said, Mr. Colton, I'd like to write you a letter. I'd like to put it in your attorney's file. Is that all right? I said, yes, ma'am. The letter was 4 pages. I read it twice in her office. It said in plain English that Henry Edward Colton, age 62, demonstrated full cognitive capacity, intact executive function, and complete financial decision-making competency. It said I scored in the top percentiles for my age group on every measure she'd administered. It said any future questions about my competency could be addressed by contacting her office directly. It was notarized through her assistant. It was filed with Louise the next morning. I drove home. I put a copy of the letter in the bottom drawer of the desk in the den, in a manila folder marked Merritt 2022 in pencil. I closed the drawer. I didn't think about it for almost a year. I did not call him. Not yet. That came later. In January of 2023, Tyler started making calls he didn't tell me about. I want to be careful here, because I didn't know about them in the moment. I learned about them slowly, in pieces, the way you learn about a leak in a roof. You see one stain on the ceiling and you think it's nothing. You see another stain 3 weeks later. You start to put it together. The first call I learned about was to my sister-in-law, Margaret's older sister, Eileen, who lives in Hendersonville. Eileen is 71. She and Margaret were close. She and I are friendly. She calls me twice a year, on my birthday and on the anniversary of Margaret's passing. Always those 2 days. In February of 2023, she called me on neither of those days. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon. It was 2:14 in the afternoon. I wrote that down. She said, Henry, I just wanted to check in on you. I said, I'm fine, Eileen. How are you? She said, I'm fine. I'm fine. Tyler called the other day. I said, did he? She said, yes. He said, well, he was worried. I said, about what? There was a pause. I could hear her breathing. She was choosing her words carefully. And Eileen is not a careful woman. She's a direct woman. She was being careful because somebody had asked her to be. She said, he just said he's been noticing some things. Since Margaret. He wanted to know if I'd noticed anything. I said, had you? She said, no. No, Henry. You sound the same as you ever did. I said, good. She said, I just wanted you to know he'd called. I said, thank you, Eileen. I appreciate that. When I hung up, I wrote it down. February 7th, 2023, 2:14 p.m. Eileen called. Said Tyler had called her. Said Tyler said he was worried. Said Tyler had asked her if she'd noticed anything since Margaret. She said no. I sat with that for a long time. I made coffee. I drank it. I thought about it. That was the second thing I wrote down. It still wasn't enough to act on. One call to a sister-in-law could be a young man who didn't know how to grieve out loud and was making strange phone calls to the family. I'd seen that before. Grief makes young men do odd things. But then it kept going. A few weeks later, in late February, a cousin of mine sent me a text message. His name is Doyle. He lives in Tennessee. He's the son of my father's youngest brother. I had not heard from Doyle since 2014 when my father passed. I went to the funeral. He went to the funeral. We shook hands. That was the last conversation we had. His text said, "Hey, Henry. Been thinking about you. Heard things have been hard lately. Just wanted to say I'm here if you need anything." I read the text 3 times. Things had not been hard. Things had been the same. I'd had a good winter. I'd seen Louise twice for routine paperwork. I'd had dinner with 2 old friends. I'd gone to 2 football games at the high school in town because I liked sitting in the cold. Nothing had been hard. I wrote it down. February 24th, 2023, Doyle texted. Said he'd heard things were hard. Asked if I needed anything. Doyle has not contacted me since 2014. 3 things now. Tyler asking about the accounts. Eileen calling on a random Tuesday. Doyle texting from another state. All of them gentle. All of them careful. All of them at the wrong angle to anything I'd actually lived through. The 4th thing came a week after Doyle's text. Paul's wife, Carol, called me. Paul is an old friend, not a relative. He and I used to fish at Lake Lure in the early 90s. Carol and Margaret were close enough to exchange Christmas cards. Carol had not called me directly in maybe 4 years. Paul called sometimes. Carol didn't. She said, "Henry, this is Carol." I said, "Carol, good to hear from you." She said, "Paul's out. I wanted to call you while he was out." I sat down. She said, "Henry, Tyler called me last week. He called the house. He said he wanted to talk to me, not Paul. He said he was worried about you and he wanted to know if I'd noticed anything." I said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "I told him you sounded fine. I told him I hadn't seen you since the funeral, but you'd written me a card last Christmas and the handwriting was the same as it always was." I said, "Thank you, Carol." She said, "Henry, I don't want to get in the middle of family, but I didn't like the call. I want you to know I didn't like it. He was fishing." I said, "I know he was fishing." She said, "All right. I just wanted to tell you. I won't tell Paul. You tell Paul when you're ready." I said, "I appreciate that, Carol, more than I can say." She said, "Margaret would have called me too." That almost broke me. I had to set the phone down for a second and pick it back up. I thanked her. I hung up. I wrote it down. March 4th, 2023, Carol called. Said Tyler had called the house asking about me. Said he'd asked her to talk while Paul was out. Said she didn't like the call. Said Margaret would have called her too. That was the 4th thing. And the 4th thing was the one that stopped feeling like a pattern and started feeling like a campaign. The receipt did not scare me. The signature did. I want to explain that, because it's the thing that turned the corner for me. The receipt was a metaphor I'd used my whole working life. You can buy lumber for 40 years. The receipts pile up. They're paper. They don't mean anything by themselves. But the signature on the bottom of a contract, somebody's name in ink, that's a different thing. That's a promise. That's a piece of a man. Tyler hadn't signed anything yet, but he was practicing the signature. He was finding out who in the family would believe a particular kind of story. He was building the audience. The signature would come later. The signature would be a guardianship petition, or a request for power of attorney, or a phone call to a bank claiming concern. I'd seen this pattern in my industry once with a partner who'd watched a friend's father lose his business to a niece. I knew what the signature looked like before it was signed. I called Louise. I drove to her office on a Wednesday morning in early March. I parked on Patton Avenue. I walked up the stairs. I sat across from her at the table she uses for clients. She had a yellow legal pad in front of her. I had the notebook in my hand. I said, "Louise, I want to walk you through something." I opened the notebook. I read her the entries. I read them in order. October 16th, November 11th, December 23rd, February 7th, February 24th. I read her exactly what people had said. I didn't editorialize. She listened the way she always listens. She didn't take notes. She knew she didn't need to. When I finished, she sat with her hands on the table for a long moment. She said, "Henry, do you want to wait, or do you want to move?" I said, "What does moving look like?" She said, "Irrevocable trust. Everything liquid. 3.9, give or take. We name the beneficiaries you choose. Tyler is not a trustee. Tyler is not a co-trustee. Tyler does not get notified. If anyone files anything against you, a guardianship petition, a power of attorney challenge, Dr. Merritt's letter answers it before it gets out of the gate. The trust is bulletproof because the competency evaluation is bulletproof." I said, "What if I wait?" She said, "Then he keeps making calls. And one day he files something and we have to fight it and we win because of the letter. But you spend a year fighting. And it gets into the family. And every cousin and aunt has to pick a side." I said, "I don't want a year of fighting." She said, "Then we move." I said, "Do it." She said, "I'll have the trust documents drafted by Monday." I drove home. I didn't tell anyone. I made dinner. I ate it standing at the counter because Margaret's chair was empty and some nights I couldn't sit across from it. I went to bed. I slept the way I'd been sleeping since 2019, which is not deeply, but enough. There is a difference between being old and being unprepared. I want to say that again, because it's the line that keeps me sane on the nights when I still think about Tyler. Old men are not what young men think they are. Young men think old men are slow. Old men are not slow. Old men are deliberate. There is a difference between the two. A slow man is late because his legs don't work. A deliberate man is late because he is thinking about whether the door behind him is locked. Tyler thought I was slow. I was deliberate. He didn't know the difference yet. He would soon. By the time the phone rang, I already knew. It rang on a Sunday afternoon, March 19th, 2023. 4:38 p.m. I was at the kitchen table. The notebook was open in front of me, because I had a feeling, and when I had a feeling I left the notebook open the way Margaret used to leave a candle lit. Tyler said, "Hey, Pops." I said, "Tyler." He said, "How's your week been?" I said, "Fine. Yours?" He said, "Good. Good. Listen, I wanted to talk to you about something." I said, "All right." He said, "Some people in the family have been worried about you." I said, "Have they?" He said, "Yeah, I mean, nothing crazy, just, you know, they've been noticing some things. And I think it might be a good idea for you to talk to someone, just to be safe." I let the silence hang. I didn't rush to fill it. The silence was the most expensive thing I owned in that moment, and I wasn't going to spend it cheap. He said, "Pops, are you there?" I said, "I'm here, Tyler." He said, "What do you think?" I said, "Who in the family?" He said, "I don't want to put anyone on the spot." I said, "Of course." He said, I love you. I want what's best." I said, "I know, Tyler." He said, "So, will you think about it?" I said, "I'll think about it." He said, Okay. That's all I'm asking." I hung up the phone. I picked up the pen. I wrote, March 19th, 2023, 4:38 p.m. Tyler called. Said some people in the family had been worried. Said he thought I should talk to someone. Wouldn't say who in the family. Said he loved me. Said that was all he was asking. Then I closed the notebook. I sat with my hand on the cover. I looked at Margaret's chair. I did not call him. Not yet. I'll tell you what I did instead. I walked into the den. I opened the bottom drawer of the desk. I took out the manila folder marked Merit 2022. I sat at the kitchen table with the folder and the notebook side by side. I read Dr. Merritt's letter again, the first time I'd read it since 2022. I read it twice. The words were the same as they'd been. The score was the same. The conclusion was the same. The notary stamp was the same. I thought about how a piece of paper can wait. A 4-page letter, sitting in a manila folder, in a bottom drawer, in a den, in a house in the mountains. It can wait 11 months without losing any of its weight. The letter didn't get tired. It didn't drift. It didn't change its mind. It sat there, doing exactly the job I had asked it to do, which was to exist. Margaret used to say that the best thing about good paperwork was that it didn't have moods. She said that the day we closed on the house in 1984. She had been a teacher long enough to know what a clean transcript could do for a kid, and a clean deed for a marriage, and a clean will for a family. She said paperwork was a kindness you did for the people who would have to figure things out after you were gone. I put the letter back in the folder. I put the folder back in the drawer. I closed the drawer. I went to bed. There is a moment in a man's life when he has to choose between being seen as kind and being honest about what is happening to him. I had been seen as kind for 41 years with Margaret beside me, and I had earned the right to choose honesty without it costing me anything I valued. Tyler did not understand that yet. He thought my kindness was a leash. He didn't know that kindness without consequences is just a habit, and habits can be set down. The trust documents were ready on Tuesday. I drove to Louise's office on Wednesday, March 22, 2023. I sat at the table. She slid the documents across to me. I read every page. 47 pages. I didn't rush. I asked her 3 questions. She answered them. I signed. $3,960,000 moved into the Henry E. and Margaret R. Colton Irrevocable Trust by Friday afternoon. The trustee was a fiduciary firm out of Charlotte that Louise had vetted twice. The successor trustee was Louise herself. The beneficiaries were 2 charities Margaret had cared about, a scholarship fund at the community college where she'd taken her teaching certificate in 1981, and a small remainder set aside for Tyler, which would distribute when he turned 45. With conditions. Not because I hated him, because I loved him, and I knew that the version of him I'd want to give money to wouldn't exist for another 14 years, if it existed at all. Tyler was not notified. He was not on any account. He was not a trustee. He was not a co-trustee. He was not a contingent. He was a beneficiary subject to a vesting schedule he did not know existed. The transfer itself took most of 2 days. Louise's office coordinated with the brokerage firm in Charlotte and the custodian who held the IRA. The lot money moved through a settlement account I'd set up the year before. The wire confirmations came in one at a time on Thursday and Friday. I sat at the kitchen table on Friday afternoon and Louise called me at 3:11 p.m. to tell me the last wire had cleared. I wrote that down too. March 24, 2023, 3:11 p.m. Last wire cleared. Trust fully funded. 3.96. I sat with that number for a while. $3,960,000. It is a strange thing to look at a number like that written in a spiral notebook. It is a stranger thing to know the number is no longer something you can spend on a whim, because you have given it to a trustee who will spend it on the things you told them to spend it on, in the order you told them, after you are gone. There is a kind of relief in that. I had spent 38 years earning that money one invoice at a time. I had spent 5 years after Margaret's death managing it carefully. Now it was managing itself. The job was done. Louise asked me what I wanted to do with the Merritt letter. I said, I want to mail it to him. She said, just the letter? I said, just the letter, no note. She said, all right, Henry. She made the copy for me. 4 pages. Original notary stamp on the last page. She put it in a manila envelope. She handed it to me. I drove to the post office in town that same afternoon. The clerk at the counter is a woman named Brenda who I've known since 1991. She used to deliver mail before they moved her inside. Her husband bought lumber from me twice in the 90s. She doesn't make small talk anymore because she's tired, and I respect that. She weighed the envelope. She told me the postage. I paid in cash. She slid the envelope into the gray bin behind her. I drove home. I sat in the truck in my driveway for a long time. I looked at the front of the house I'd built in 1984, the brick on the chimney that I'd laid by hand, the window over the sink where Margaret used to stand in the morning, the walkway I'd poured the summer James was born. I went inside. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. I opened the notebook. I wrote, March 24th, 2023, mailed Dr. Merritt's letter to Tyler. No note. 3.96 moved to trust on March 22nd. Trust executed. Letter postmarked Asheville today. Then I closed the notebook for the last time on that subject. And if stories like this remind you that quiet people are not weak people, subscribe to my channel for more stories. Because sometimes the strongest response is the one nobody sees coming. I want to tell you what happened after the letter arrived, because this is the part people ask about. The letter would have reached Tyler's apartment in Charlotte on Monday, March 27th. He didn't call me Monday. He didn't call me Tuesday. He called me Wednesday night, March 29th at 9:11 p.m. I was reading at the kitchen table. The notebook was closed, but I opened it when I saw his name on the phone. I let it ring 4 times. Then I picked up. I said, Tyler. He said, Pops. Hi. His voice was different. It was higher in his throat. The smoothness was gone. The practiced kindness was gone. He sounded like a man who'd just opened an envelope and read a thing he hadn't expected. He said, I got something in the mail from you. I said, all right. He said, It's a letter from a doctor. I said, yes. He said, it says you had a competency evaluation. I said, yes. He said, in April of last year. I said, April 14th, 2022. There was a long silence. I let it sit. I'd gotten good at letting silences sit. He said, why did you send me this? I said, because I thought you might want it. He said, I don't. Pops, I don't understand. I said, I think you do. He said, I was trying to help. I said, Tyler, I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this once and then I'm going to wish you a good night. He said, okay. I said, I have known what you were doing since October. I have a notebook. I have dates. I have names. Eileen called me. Doyle texted me. Your call to me in March is in the notebook word for word. I do not need you to apologize because an apology now would not be honest. I do not need you to explain because an explanation now would not be honest either. I need you to know that I knew. That is the only thing I need. He said, Pops. I said, I love you, Tyler. That has not changed. What has changed is that you will not be part of the decisions I make about what I built. That is a consequence. It is a quiet one. You will not see a court. You will not see a will. You will not see an account. You will see what you have always seen, which is me. I will still answer the phone on Sundays if you call. I will still come to your wedding if you have one. I will still be your grandfather. But the things you tried to take are gone from the room you tried to take them in. They are somewhere else now. They are not for you. He said, Pops. I said, good night, Tyler. I hung up. I wrote it down. March 29th, 2023, 9:11 p.m. Tyler called. He'd received the letter. He said he didn't understand. I told him I knew what he'd been doing since October. I told him the consequence. He started to speak. I wished him good night. I closed the notebook. I put it on the shelf above the desk in the den. It has stayed there since. I want to tell you about what happened to him because I know you want to know. He didn't call again for almost 6 months. When he called in September, he asked how I was. He didn't ask about anything else. We talked for 9 minutes. I was kind. He was careful. The conversation was the conversation of 2 men who both knew exactly what the other one knew. There was something almost restful about it. Eileen called me in May. She told me Tyler had called her again asking if she'd noticed anything different about how I sounded. She told him she hadn't. She told him she didn't want him calling her about me anymore. She said it kindly. She said Tyler had been quiet, and then said he understood and then hung up. She told me she should have said something to me sooner. I told her she had said something. She had called me in February. That was something. Doyle never texted again. James, my son, called me in July. The first time in 6 years. I do not know what Tyler told him, or what Tyler didn't tell him, but James called and said he wanted to come up and see me. He came up in August. We sat on the porch for 3 hours. We didn't fix everything. We fixed enough to keep going. I do not know how much of that was Tyler, or how much of that was time, or how much of that was Margaret reaching across from wherever she is and pulling the two of us back into the same room. I am not a man who tries to know things like that. I am a man who is grateful when they happen. The trust runs the way trusts run. Quietly. It pays out to the charities every year. The scholarship at the community college has a name on it now, Margaret's name. There are 3 young women a year who take that money and go become teachers, the way Margaret did in 1981 with no money and a borrowed car and a head full of ideas. I'd like to think she'd find that funny. I'd like to think she'd find a lot of this funny. I keep the notebook on the shelf in the den. I open it sometimes. Not often. The last entry is March 29th, 2023, 9:11 p.m. There's nothing after that. I have not needed to write anything down since. I want to say something about the letter before I close. The letter is what people remember when they ask me about this story. They say, "Henry, you got the letter 11 months in advance." That's the thing. That's the move. And I let them say that because it's not wrong. Dr. Merritt's letter was the move. Without it, none of the rest of it works. Without it, Tyler's calls to Eileen and Doyle eventually find a relative who picks up the phone to a lawyer somewhere and asks a question I'd have to answer in a courtroom. Without it, the trust takes longer. Without it, the whole story is a year of fighting, like Louise said. But the letter wasn't really the move. The move was sitting down with Louise in the spring of 2022 and listening to a woman who'd seen this happen to other men, and trusting her enough to spend an afternoon in a neuropsychologist's office when nothing was wrong. The move was patience. The move was respecting the woman who told me to do it, before I knew I'd need it. Margaret used to say there were 2 kinds of men in the world. The men who fix the roof when it's raining, and the men who fix it before. She married the second kind on purpose. She told me that once at a kitchen table in 1979, 3 weeks before she said yes. She said, "Henry, I'm not marrying you because you're handsome. I'm marrying you because you would fix the roof in July." That's still the nicest thing anyone ever said about me. I think about it almost every day. I am not telling this story because I want anyone to admire me. I am telling it because there is somebody listening who has a grandson, or a son, or a niece, or a neighbor, who has started asking questions in a voice that doesn't sound right. There is somebody listening who has been told by a family member that they're not the same since they lost the person they loved. There is somebody listening who has a notebook in a drawer somewhere, or could buy one tomorrow at the drugstore. If that's you, I want to say 2 things to you and then I'll let you go. The first thing is this. You are not crazy for noticing. You have lived a long life and you know what a wrong note sounds like. Trust that. Write down the dates. Write down the words. Don't argue with anyone about what they mean. Just write them down. Meaning shows up on its own when there are enough entries. The second thing is this. Go see your lawyer. Not because you're afraid. Because you've earned the right to be unafraid. A good lawyer in a small town will sit with you for an hour and tell you what a competency letter costs, and what an irrevocable trust costs, and how long the paperwork takes, and which neuropsychologist she sends people to. You will spend an afternoon. You will spend a few $1,000s. You will walk out with a piece of paper that nobody can take from you. And then, if the day comes when someone tries to tell the family that you're losing your mind, you will already have the answer. Filed. Notarized. Waiting. That's the whole lesson. That's the only thing I know that's worth saying out loud about any of this. Margaret has been gone almost 7 years now. I still don't sit in her chair. I still keep the notebook on the shelf. I still walk 3 miles every morning. I still take the stairs 2 at a time when nobody's watching. I am 64 years old. I built a company. I built a house. I built a marriage. I built a son. And the son built a grandson. And the grandson tried to tell a story about me that wasn't true. He lost that story to a 4-page letter from a woman in Asheville who'd never met him and never would. I never raised my voice. I raised the consequences.